Scott Fischer was everything Rob Hall wasn't. Where Rob was careful, Scott was bold. Where Rob followed rules, Scott trusted instinct. Where Rob was methodical, Scott was spontaneous. Rob was the perfectionist, Scott was the free spirit. And on May 10, 1996, they both died on the same mountain. This is Scott Fischer's story. The man who climbed Everest sick. The guide who refused to admit weakness. The free spirit who pushed too far. Scott was born in 1955 in Michigan. From childhood, he was different, energetic, fearless, always pushing boundaries. Other kids played it safe. Scott climbed trees, jumped off roofs, tested limits. His parents worried. "Slow down, Scott. Be careful." Scott would laugh. "Careful is boring. Life is for living." This attitude never changed. It defined his entire life. By his 20s, Scott was climbing seriously, not methodically like Rob. Scott climbed with joy, with freedom, with abandon. He wasn't reckless. Scott was skilled, very skilled. He understood mountains, respected them, but he believed climbing should be fun, an adventure, not a military operation. Mountains aren't problems to solve, Scott would say. They're places to experience, to feel alive. In 1994, Scott summited Everest for the first time without supplemental oxygen, an incredible achievement, proof of his strength and skill.
He could have played it safe, used oxygen, made it easier. But Scott wanted the challenge, the raw experience, the purity.
After that success, Scott started his guiding company, Mountain Madness. The name said everything, not adventure consultants like Rob's company. Mountain Madness, fun, bold, different. Scott's guiding philosophy was simple. We're going to summit, and we're going to have a great time doing it. Clients loved him. Scott was charismatic, funny, inspiring. Where Rob's clients respected him, Scott's clients adored him. He made them feel like friends, like equals, like adventurers, not customers. One client said, "Scott made me feel invincible, like I could do anything. That's a gift." Another said, "Rob Hall was the safe choice. Scott Fischer was the exciting choice. I wanted exciting." But there was a difference. Rob's carefulness kept people alive. Scott's boldness sometimes put them at risk, not intentionally. Scott wasn't reckless with other people's lives. He just believed in human potential, in pushing limits, in trusting people to rise to challenges. "If you think you can't do it, you won't," Scott would say. "Believe you can, and you will." This worked. Most of the time. Scott's clients summited, came home, told amazing stories, but Scott's approach had a weakness. He applied it to himself too, even when he shouldn't. In 1996, Scott wasn't healthy. He'd been having altitude problems, headaches, fatigue, breathing difficulties. Friends noticed. "Scott, maybe sit this season out. Rest, come back stronger." Scott refused. "I'm fine. Just need to push through it." He believed in mind over matter, in willpower, in refusing to accept limitations. This had always worked before. Scott had climbed through pain, through exhaustion, through doubt, and succeeded. But Everest doesn't care about willpower. Altitude sickness doesn't respond to positive thinking. The death zone doesn't negotiate. Scott knew this intellectually, but emotionally, he couldn't accept weakness, not in himself. So he climbed, May 1996. Leading his clients, hiding his sickness, Scott assembled his team. 7 clients, good guides, strong Sherpas. Among them was Anatoly Bukreev, a Kazakh climber, one of the strongest mountaineers in the world. Anatoly was Scott's opposite, quiet, intense, focused. He climbed without oxygen, climbed fast, climbed alone. Scott and Anatoly disagreed on guiding philosophy. Anatoly believed guides should climb ahead, scout the route, be strong and available for rescues. Scott believed guides should stay with clients, slow down, be present, support them emotionally. Both approaches had merit, but they created tension. On summit day, this tension would matter. Deadly matter. May 10, 1996. Scott woke up sick, very sick, headache, nausea, exhaustion. His team was ready to go. Clients excited, Sherpas prepared, everything set. Scott had a choice. Cancel the summit attempt, admit weakness, disappoint everyone. Or push through. Believe in himself, trust his strength. Scott chose to climb, because that's who Scott was, the man who never quit, who never showed weakness, who always believed he could push through. It was his greatest strength and his fatal flaw. The climb started at 4 a.m. Scott was slow, slower than usual, struggling. His clients noticed. "Scott, are you okay?" "I'm fine, just warming up, let's go." But he wasn't fine. The altitude was destroying him. His body was shutting down. He needed to descend immediately. But Scott kept climbing because his clients were climbing, because he was the leader, because quitting wasn't in his nature. By afternoon, Scott was in serious trouble, falling behind, barely moving. Anatoly reached the summit, descended quickly, tried to help clients. Scott was higher on the mountain, alone, sick, dying. He sat down, just for a moment, to rest, catch his breath. He never got up. Anatoly found him the next day, sitting in the snow, above the Hillary step, like he'd just fallen asleep. Scott Fischer, 40 years old, dead, because he refused to admit weakness. Here's the tragedy. Scott knew he was sick, knew he shouldn't climb, knew the risks, but admitting weakness felt like failure, like letting people down, like being less than who he believed himself to be. Scott's entire identity was built on strength, on pushing through, on never quitting. How could he be the guide who turned back because he felt sick? How could he disappoint his clients? How could he admit he wasn't invincible? He couldn't. So he climbed and died. This is the danger of being a free spirit on Everest. The mountain requires discipline, structure, rules. Scott believed in freedom, in trusting yourself, in following your heart. But Everest doesn't care about your heart. Everest has rules, absolute rules. Break them, you die. After Scott's death, people debated, was he reckless? Was he brave? Was he both? Anatoly Bukreev wrote a book, The Climb, defending Scott, explaining the decisions, the philosophy. Jon Krakauer wrote Into Thin Air, criticizing some of Scott's choices, the lack of oxygen, the loose structure. The debate became bitter, personal. Both men believed they understood Scott. Both were probably right and wrong, because Scott was complicated. He was brave and reckless, inspiring and foolish, strong and stubborn. He made Everest feel accessible, fun, adventurous. That was his gift, but he also made it feel safer than it was. That was his danger. Scott left behind 3 children, a family who loved him, clients who believed in him, friends who admired him. One friend said Scott lived more in 40 years than most people live in 80. He died doing what he loved. Another said Scott's death was preventable if he'd just admitted he was sick, if he'd just turned back. Both statements are true. Both capture different parts of Scott Fischer, the free spirit who lived fully and died unnecessarily. Here's what Scott's story teaches us. Strength isn't just physical. It's knowing when to stop, when to admit weakness, when to turn back. True courage isn't pushing through everything. It's knowing your limits, respecting them. Scott Fischer was incredibly strong, but he couldn't admit weakness, and that killed him. On Everest, ego is deadly, pride is deadly, refusing to accept limitations is deadly. The mountain doesn't care how strong you are, how brave, how determined. The mountain only cares about reality. Physics, biology, limits. Scott Fischer refused to accept his limits, and Everest enforced them absolutely. Rob Hall died because he cared too much. Scott Fischer died because he was too proud to quit. 2 different men, 2 different philosophies, same mountain, same day, both dead. This is part 4. Scott Fischer, the free spirit, the man who made Everest feel like an adventure until it became a tragedy. In the next part, we'll meet the clients, the ordinary people who paid $65,000 to climb Everest, who trusted Rob and Scott to keep them safe. Doug Hansen, Yasuko Namba, Beck Weathers, Jon Krakauer. Real people, real dreams, real consequences. Welcome to the human cost of ambition, where strength can be weakness, where freedom can be fatal. Scott Fischer. Remember his name, remember his spirit, remember what killed him. Because on Everest, being a free spirit isn't enough. You need discipline, structure, the wisdom to know when to turn back. Scott had the spirit, but not the wisdom, and it cost him everything.